If you agree that some stories claw their way back to the surface no matter how deeply time buries them, then like and subscribe, because what I'm about to tell you didn't begin with glory, gunfire, or any kind of heroic fanfare. It began in a quiet retirement home that smelled faintly of oatmeal, antiseptic, and fading memories. And before I go on, tell me where you're watching from, because when this story starts to unwind, you'll want to remember your vantage point. It was just past 8 in the morning when the orderlies at Clearwater shuffled down the corridor complaining about the sticky weather, the perpetual flicker in the lights above room 212, and the way the storm clouds outside pressed against the windows like they were trying to listen in. They pushed the door open expecting to find the same routine they always did. An elderly man asleep in his recliner, daytime television murmuring about nothing in particular, and that silent shadow box hanging over his bed like a relic nobody understood. Instead, they found Mr. Holden Pierce lying perfectly still beneath his quilt, the same position he'd always slept in, except this time his chest wasn't rising and falling, and his eyes were half open like he'd been watching something none of them could see. The night nurse said he'd been restless at around 3 a.m., tapping his fingers like he was counting down to something. So she checked his vitals, adjusted his blankets, and left him alone because he didn't like being hovered over. She didn't mention, at least not until later, that he'd whispered something she couldn't quite make out, something like "she's not done yet," though no one could agree on whether that's really what he said. What mattered was that when they finally allowed themselves to touch the shadow box, to unhook it from the wall where it had lived untouched for over 50 years, and crack the seal, they went dead quiet. Inside lay metals none of them recognized, shapes, colors, and insignias that didn't match anything on the public records chart pinned to the rec room bulletin board. And beneath them, folded with obsessive precision, was a letter printed on old military stationery, crisp despite the decades, bearing the unmistakably authentic signature of a general whose name most Americans only know from museums, documentaries, and war memorials. That's when I got the call. My job, for better or worse, is sorting out estates when there's no family left to do it. Most days it means helping pack boxes, making polite small talk with grieving relatives, and quietly discarding things no one wants to remember. But this time, when I stepped into room 212, the hair on my arm stood up. Pierce's belongings were minimal: a drawer of worn-out sweaters, a stack of library receipts, a single framed photograph of him standing in the snow beside a large man whose face had been purposefully scratched out. And then there was the notebook, thin but heavy with a different kind of weight, resting on the bedside table as if he'd placed it there before closing his eyes for the last time. The first pages contained technical scribbles, rope tension diagrams, muscle group notes, timed endurance charts. The kind of notes only a high-level trainer or specialist would understand. But Pierce, according to his intake records, had worked as a postal clerk before retiring. Nothing in his file suggested a military background. Nothing in his medical records suggested PTSD, injuries, or anything consistent with combat. Nothing made sense. As I flipped deeper into the notebook, the handwriting grew cleaner, more urgent. He described the program, never named, only implied, in clipped sentences that made my stomach twist. Candidates must not know the truth until the moment of failure. We cannot tell them they're being watched by more than cameras. If the committee discovers she exists, everything collapses. And then, on a page in the very center, circled 3 times in dark graphite, was a name: Lieutenant Claire Donovan, a birth year, 1998. And beneath that, a line that sent an electric pulse down my spine. The last one who made me believe. If you follow military news or training performance analysis, you know that name. Donovan is the woman who walked into a sealed training evaluation earlier this year, at 27, in a sun-faded hoodie, carrying a clipboard, then shattered a 2-decade-old record by 9 seconds. No explanations, no credentials anyone could verify. She'd left before half the platoon finished processing what happened. Rumors spread like wildfire. She was a prodigy, a myth, a plant, an experiment, a ghost. But no one, not even the teams she briefly advised, seemed to understand who she really was. And now here she was, written in the notebook of an old man who died alone, decades before she was born. I checked the dates 3 times. It didn't add up. Couldn't. Yet the handwriting was undeniably from the 70s. Ink degradation, page oxidation, everything consistent with age, and the letter in the shadow box, stamped with the seal of a now-defunct military division, mentioned an operation I'd never heard of, Winter Torch. The general thanked Pierce for protecting the final lineage, whatever that meant, and for shielding the remaining successor from identification. Successor. My mouth went dry when I read that. Successor to what? Pierce's quiet life didn't match anything I was seeing, yet the more I looked around his room, the more I noticed the cracks in the facade. A titanium knee scar hidden beneath his pajamas, calluses on his palms in places consistent with rogue training, a faint tattoo on his shoulder, faded to near invisibility, and a symbol that matched one of the unidentifiable metals. And then there was his expression, the faint smile still on his face, the kind you see on someone who finally lets go after carrying something too heavy for too long. I found myself staring at the shadow box again, unable to shake the feeling that whatever Pierce had been guarding for half a century wasn't gone with him. It was out there. It was alive. And her name was written in dark graphite circles. Before I left the room, I checked the notebook one more time, and that's when I saw the final page. Blank except for one freshly written sentence. Ink still glossy, meaning he must have written it within hours of his death. If she breaks the record, the window opens. The window to what? I didn't know then. But I do now. And before we go any further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because this isn't the kind of story you hear by accident, and once you know the truth, you'll never look at that record-breaking run the same way again. The moment I heard that quiet female voice outside the archive room door say, "You have something that belonged to him," every instinct I had told me not to look up, not because I thought she would hurt me, but because something in her tone carried a certainty, a steadiness, that made the air tighten around my ribs like the room itself was bracing. Still, I turned, slowly, and standing there in the threshold, framed by the flickering hallway lights and dripping rainwater from the hood of her jacket, was Lieutenant Claire Donovan, 27 years old, unassuming in stature, yet impossibly grounded, like she was aligned with some center of gravity the rest of us didn't know existed. And for a long breath we simply stared at each other, the storm crackling against the windows while the security monitor blinked behind her, useless now that the thing it warned me about was already inside the room. I expected nerves, or adrenaline, or fear to kick in, but what hit me instead was the recognition, the kind you get only when a story that never made sense suddenly clicks into place, and the impossible becomes inevitable. She didn't say anything else right away, just scanned the notebooks, the files, the shadow box I'd brought along in my back, and then she stepped inside with a movement that wasn't hurried but carried the same effortless precision she'd shown in those viral clicks of her record-breaking run, the kind of precision that made it clear she wasn't trained the way most people are trained, but in a manner more exacting, more internal, as if her body had been conditioned for something older and deeper than modern military doctrine. She set her backpack down, water pooling around the rubber soles of her boots, and I could see now that she wasn't dressed for a visit. She was dressed like someone expecting a chase, which made my pulse spike, because if she was running from something, I had just placed myself right between her and whatever it was. I slid the notebook closer to her and she exhaled, slow and quiet, like the sight of it hurt more than the rain ever could, and for a moment she didn't touch it. She just looked at Pierce's awkward scrawl, her expression flickering with something I couldn't identify. Grief, maybe, or recognition, or the ache of carrying a truth too long without the words to voice it. She finally rested her fingertips on the cover, and I felt the room shift around us, felt reality bend in a way that made my stomach flip, because she wasn't reacting like someone surprised by its existence. She was reacting like someone who had been waiting her entire life for this moment. "He wasn't supposed to die alone," she whispered. But not to me. It sounded more like she was scolding herself, or the storm, or fate, or all three, and the guilt in her voice didn't match the public image of the confident prodigy who had embarrassed a platoon of SEALs. This was someone who carried a responsibility she shouldn't have had to bear at her age. When she finally opened the notebook, she flipped to the center pages without looking, like she already knew where everything was, confirming what I had suspected since the moment I read Pierce's notes. The connection between them wasn't accidental. She traced her name on the page, the one circled 3 times, then glanced at the birth year written beneath it, her brow tightening because she clearly recognized the impossibility. She wasn't alive when Pierce began writing, yet the ink was undeniably decades old, and the contradiction didn't seem to surprise her. Instead, she looked at me with eyes that carried a heaviness far older than 27 years and said, "He wrote what the others were too afraid to." Others. The word hit like a hammer. That meant Pierce wasn't the only one connected to her, nor the only one who knew about whatever lineage the general had mentioned. I wanted to ask 100 questions, but the storm outside cracked with a bolt that shook the building, and Claire's head snapped toward the window, not in fear, but in calculation, like she was measuring the timing between lightning and thunder. She pulled the shadow box from my bag next, holding it with a reverence that made me realize she had seen these metals before, not the physical set, but what they symbolized. "These belonged to the first generation," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "The ones who were chosen before the project was buried." She looked up at me like she could see the questions forming behind my eyes, so many that I could barely keep track of them. But she anticipated the most pressing one. "Operation Winter Torch wasn't a mission," she said. "It was an experiment. Not on weapons, not on technology, on people." Her voice didn't shake, mine would have. She explained, in terms too calm for the weight they carried, that the program had been designed to cultivate an inherited combat instinct, a genetic training memory, passed not through experience but biology, as if each successor could unlock the abilities of those who came before. It shouldn't have been possible, but as she spoke, everything I'd seen, the record run, the notebook, the medals, the letter, began fitting together into a shape I didn't want to recognize. She closed the notebook and shouldered her pack again. "Pierce was my last link to the truth," she said. "Which means I'm out of time." I asked, because I had to. Out of time for what? Claire didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the doorway, paused, and gave me the kind of look soldiers give when they're choosing whether to bring someone into the line of fire. Then she said, "The window he wrote about, it's not a metaphor. And tonight, something else opened with it." Before I could ask anything, the security monitor beeped again. Someone else had entered the building. Claire stiffened, not with fear, but readiness, and I realized then that Pierce hadn't been protecting a secret. He'd been protecting her, and whoever was coming down that hallway now wasn't here for me. They were here to close the lineage forever. Claire stepped back into the room, grabbed my wrist, and whispered, "Whatever happens next, don't let go of the notebook." Then the footsteps stopped just outside the door, and the handle began to turn. The doorknob turned with a slow, deliberate certainty, as though the person on the other side had rehearsed this exact moment for decades. And when the door eased open, the man who stepped inside wasn't the armed intruder I had expected, but someone far more unsettling. A tall, rigid figure in a weather-beaten field coat, his face carved with the kind of disciplined stillness that only comes from training so severe it strips the humanity out of a person molecule by molecule. He didn't flinch at the stormlight flickering across our faces, didn't react to Claire's stepping protectively in front of me, didn't even glance at the security camera blinking uselessly above the doorway, because he already knew it wasn't recording anymore. His gaze fixed on Claire with a heaviness I couldn't decipher, half recognition, half grief, and in a voice that sounded like it had been breaking for years, he said, "It should have ended with us." The words weren't an accusation. They were an elegy, a warning, maybe even a plea, and Claire's jaw tightened as though she had braced for exactly this confrontation. She didn't speak, didn't challenge him, didn't hide, just matched his stillness with a quiet resolve that vibrated through the room like a held breath. He stepped further inside, shutting the door behind him with the soft click of inevitability, then reached beneath his coat. Not for a weapon, though my pulse spiked as if he had, but for a leather ID case so worn the edges curled like old petals, embossed with the same insignia etched into one of Pierce's impossible metals. He placed it on the table between us with a gravity that felt ceremonial, like laying a wreath on a grave, and said that Operation Winter Torch had never been a mission in the traditional sense, but an attempt to artificially trigger what evolution would not grant on its own. Inherited instinct, generational memory, the transfer of skill through blood instead of training. A lineage designed to create soldiers who didn't learn but remembered. The program had ended, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well in its earliest subjects, ripping their minds apart under the weight of abilities their bodies could not contain, leaving the survivors fractured, hyper-aware, dangerously unpredictable, and burdened with combat reflexes that fired like reflexive ghosts long after the battlefield was gone. Pierce had been the youngest among them, the one who escaped with his sanity mostly intact, and because of that, he had been chosen, damned, the man corrected bitterly, to ensure the lineage never continued beyond their generation. But then Claire had been born. Not trained, not engineered, born. The pure version of what the program had tried and failed to construct. A successor whose abilities emerged naturally, without external intervention, as though fate or biology had bypassed the ethics committee and crowned her with everything the early subjects had bled for. And Pierce, recognizing her for what she was the moment she shattered her first training metric at 19, had vanished from public records, leaving behind the life he had built so he could shield her from the same fate that devoured the others. The man stepped closer to Claire, and for a second I thought he might embrace her. But instead he spoke with the exhausted tone of someone who had been running from ghosts for half a century. If you stay, they will find you. If you run, they will chase you. If you fight, you become the weapon they feared. But Claire, steady as a lit fuse, looked at him with a calm that was almost frightening in its clarity. She said, voice barely above a whisper, that Pierce hadn't spent his life in hiding to protect a weapon. He had protected a person. Her. And she wasn't about to spend the rest of her life pretending she didn't know what she was capable of. The man closed his eyes, as if the answer confirmed a prophecy he'd prayed would die unfulfilled, and when he opened them again, the resignation there was almost too heavy to look at. Claire lifted the notebook from the table, tucking it under her arm as though absorbing the responsibility stitched into its pages, and turned to leave, but before she could step past him, he murmured, "The window opened the moment you broke that record." Others felt it. That word, others, stuck to the air like frost. I asked who he meant, but neither of them acknowledged me. I had become background in a conversation far older and heavier than I deserved to witness. They both stepped into the hall, shadows stretching long and thin under the dying emergency lights. And just before the storm swallowed them, Claire turned back and told me not to follow, not to speak of her, not to look for her, a request that already felt doomed. Because the moment she stepped into the darkness, something in the world shifted, like the timeline realigned around her absence. By morning, the building's logs showed no entries after closing. The security archives were blank. Pierce's belongings had been claimed by a confirmed relative, even though none existed, and every trace of Claire Donovan's military history had been quietly removed from the databases I had accessed only hours earlier. The medals, the letter, even the scanned images I had saved were overwritten or corrupted, replaced with error messages that made my screen sputter and flicker like it was choking on truth. For days I slept poorly, waking to odd sounds, footsteps, shuffling, the faint click of a doorknob that never fully turned. And though I kept telling myself I had imagined them, my nerves never settled. Then, a week after the night, everything changed. A small, unmarked parcel slid through the mail slot of my home. No return address. No postage. No knock. Inside was a single page torn from Pierce's notebook, edges frayed like it had been ripped out in haste, covered in handwriting that wasn't Pierce's, but Claire's. It read, simply, "The window didn't close." It widened. Beneath it were coordinates, and the realization that whatever lineage she represented, whatever force had pulled her out of obscurity and into a life of shadows, hadn't ended that night. It had only begun to breathe.